Thanks for choosing the most exciting topic in the conference, though, right? We're going to talk about logging.
Everybody uses logs.
That's right. Everybody uses logs. It's universal, right? So I'm Mike Banks. I'm a principal engineer with Progress. I've been with the Paths for OpenEdge project kind of since its inception. So I'll be talking about what we've done mainly in 12.0 to change logging for Paths for OpenEdge. So how many of you use or have used Paths for OpenEdge? Okay, good amount. That's great. So all of you know that PASOE has a bunch of different log files, and they fall into kind of categories of log files. There's the Apache Tomcat logs. There's the ABL application logs. Then we've got a few kind of additional logs, like for the debugger and things like that, right? And then our old friend, the agent log, right? Which is, if you came from Classic, you're very familiar with that log. But we've also done some changes to that log as well. So we'll talk about all of those today. All right, so why change logging? Well, what was wrong with it? Why didn't we just leave it alone? We certainly produce enough log files, right? What was the problem? Well, there were a number of different issues that we wanted to address. First of all, there was no single place that you could go to configure logging for PASOE. The logging configuration was kind of spread all over the place in the directory structure. We wanted to fix that. It wasn't easy to tailor. So if you wanted to do a customer installation and you wanted to tailor some stuff in the logging, it's all XML files. And that's tough to do with scripts, right? It's hard to tailor XML files with scripts. So we wanted to make that easier. For the same reason, it was also difficult for us, right? We want to be able to update those configurations in service packs. So if something changed with logging in a service pack, we wanted to be able to push that down, right? And then those log files were bound to the PASOE logs directory. And that causes problems, especially for things like containers. If you're doing Docker, you want those log files outside of the container. And you couldn't really do that before. And then the one that I feel like's most important, at least most important to me in my own work, is it was really difficult to track requests through the log files. You've got multiple levels of log files, and if you've got a single request that you need to follow through all those log files, you start doing funny things like trying to match up milliseconds in the timestamps to try to get a thread through those log files. So we also wanted to make that easier. Okay, so just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, this is a PASOE instance. It's got 3 ABL applications in it. Each of those ABL applications has multiple web applications. So, for example, the partner ABL app has, the supplier's ABL app has a partner's web app and a vendor's web app. Pre 12.0, each one of those web applications had a full set of logging configuration. And the problem came about, you know, if you were changing that logging configuration and you didn't get all of them consistently changed, really, really strange things would happen. So we definitely wanted to address that. Okay, so let me just take a moment to talk a little bit about logging technology, because it will help to understand kind of why and where we went with this. Whoops, too far. So pre 12.0, there's kind of the 3 layers of logging. There's the Tomcat level, there's the ABL application level, and then the agent level. Pre 12.0, Tomcat was using something called Julie, which is Java util logging. It works pretty well, but it's really difficult to configure, all right? PASOE was the ABL application layer was using logback, and the agent layer uses our own homegrown C logger. For 12.0, what we decided to do is we decided to unify the Tomcat level and the ABL application level using logback. So we switched over to using logback. A lot of advantages to that. Logback's just a much more powerful logging framework, but it also means that it makes that configuration consistent between the Tomcat level and the ABL application level. It's a big advantage. Still using that homegrown C logger for the agent, but we've also made some changes there, as we'll talk about.
You plan to use logback on the agent sometime?
It's written in the agent is written in C, and logback is a Java logging technology. There are some interesting C loggers out there, right? And we've investigated some of those, especially some low latency loggers. But you know, it's in the backlog, and we'll see if it gets prioritized higher. All right, so logback configuration, what does that look like? I mentioned that logback is configured by a bunch of XML files. The XML, the top level XML tag is a configuration tag, and that configuration is a per class loader configuration. So we're still left with two configurations at the Tomcat level and at the ABL application level. So what's in a configuration? The configuration contains some things called appenders and some things called loggers. So what's an appender? So if you're thinking about trying to get a mental model of an appender, think destination. Where are my log messages going to? And that can be multiple places. That could be the console, could be a file, could be a database, could be one of the logging consolidators like Elastic, right? So again, if you look in the configuration files, the appender, immediately think that's the destination. That's where it's going to, right? Each of those appenders includes an encoder, and the encoder has a pattern. And I put an example of the pattern down here at the bottom. We'll talk a bit more about patterns in just a minute here, but the pattern is essentially the template that shows what the logging message is going to look like when it gets to the file. All right, so it's got a bunch of substitution parameters that get filled in when the log message actually gets generated. Okay. So what's a logger? Well, there's a couple of different places where you can change the logging level. You can change the logging level globally at the appender, or you can do it individually per logger. So what's a logger? In the Java code that implements PAS for OpenEdge, every time we write a log message, we write it to a named logger. So each log message goes to a named logger. So you can turn on and off groups of log messages based on their name. If you know the name of the logger they were written to, you can turn up the logging level or turn down the logging level of that group of log messages, right? So I've given an example here. This is from the web transport. If you wanted to turn up log messages about requests, you could do that. You'd find the logger entry with the name ComProgress AppServe Adapters Web, the request logger, and you'd bump that up. Values can be trace, debug, info, warn, error, all, or off. And you'll see that's kind of now because we're unified on logback, that's kind of a consistent theme. So those are the values to control that Tomcat level and ABL application level logging. Okay, so putting all those concepts together, this is what one of those XML configuration files look like. There's that outside level configuration block. Inside the configuration is one or more appenders, and each appender has one or more encoders with that pattern in it that gives the template for the file. Okay. Then there's a list of loggers, a number of loggers, and again, those turn on and off those named destinations. And then there's a root section that gives a single default appender and a single place to control the logging level for the whole appender. So what changed for 12.0? Most of that existed in the ABL application level pre-12.0. So what changed for 12.0? Well, so I started with that list of things that we saw as shortcomings in PAS-OE logging. What our objectives were for 12.0 were we wanted that instance-wide single place to configure logging. We didn't want to have to run around to all the web applications and try to make them consistent. We also, to do that, to help with tailoring, we wanted to extract most of those configuration parameters to properties files. So it's much easier to tailor a property file than it is to tailor a bunch of XML, right? So we extracted most of the important properties to property files. In doing that solved our own problem, Progress's problem. In service packs, now those XML files, because all the user configurable stuff has been extracted, that means those XML files are essentially read-only. So in a service pack, we can update those XML files without destroying any customer tweaks to the parameters. Okay? And then we also provided multiple logging destinations, and we'll talk about that. And again, that's configurable by properties. And then the last one, that problem of tracking requests through multiple log files, we used a technology called MDC, Mapped Diagnostic Contexts, to differentiate the logging coming from different clients. And we'll see how that works today. Okay, so it's all about properties. If you walk away from this session getting one thing, it's all about properties. Okay, so let's first look at that Tomcat level. Tomcat has pretty much two main XML files that configure logging, logging-tomcat.xml and logging-access.xml. Most of the configurable parameters have been extracted into one properties file for both of those, logging-tomcat.properties. It's in the instance conf directory. So for the Tomcat level, 99% of what you want to configure for the Tomcat level is going to be in that properties file. Right? So what does it look like? Here's an example of that logging-tomcat.properties file. So let's take the Catalina log file. You can see there's a file name. It's got a template for what that file name is going to look like. And then it's got that logging level that we saw before. So again, trace, debug, info, warn, error. So if you bump that up to debug, for example, you'll start seeing a lot more log messages from the Tomcat server. Okay. So stepping down one more level, so if you look at the ABL application logging level, we still have a logging.xml that's in each one of those web applications. The difference is how that logging.xml gets its information, right? The way we did it is we used include files. So we include a couple of XML files, but we also extracted everything we could into another properties file. So the ABL application level has a second properties file, logging-pasoe.properties, and that configures most of the ABL application logging. The one exception to that, there's this logging-abl app.xml. That's where those individual logger statements live. So if you're debugging something and you need to turn on just a specific group of log messages, that's where you go. You go to that logging-abl app.xml. Okay, so what do these look like? No surprise. Again, we unified on logback, so the configuration looks a lot the same. We've got the same thing. We've got a file name, a template for the file name. We've got a pattern, which again is a template for how the log messages are going to look, and then that logging level. Again, this one is logging-pasoe.properties. So that's the ABL application level. And then I mentioned that logging-abl app. This is kind of what that looks like. I've cut out just one section, the web transport section. What we've tried to do is as we add named loggers, we list all of those named loggers in this file in logging-abl app.xml. So they're all in there, but they're all commented out. All right, so if you want to bump up the logging for one group of log messages, you find the area you want, like web transport, you want to see more about requests, you'd uncomment that one line, and then you can bump up the logging level. Does that make sense? Okay. So there's also that little bucket of extra web applications that I talked about. There's a log file for the OE manager. There's a log file for the health collector. There's a log file for the secure token service, one for the debugger. All of those are configured as well by logging-pasoe.properties. Okay, so we extracted as much as we could out of those. What we didn't do for this kind of random group of web applications, we didn't extract all the loggers from those. Most of these, it would be really rare if you have to turn on an individual logger. So we didn't go to the effort to actually extract the loggers. The one exception is the secure token service. So there is an logging-sts app.xml, and that's got the loggers for logging-oests.xml. Okay, so if you need to bump up some STS, some token service logging, that would be where to look for that. Okay, how does it look? Same thing. So this is in that same file, logging-pasoe.properties, file name pattern, the template for the log message, and the logging level. Okay, so just to reiterate one more time, say it in a different way maybe. There are two main properties files. They're both in the conf directory. There's logging-tomcat.properties and logging-pasoe.properties. Logging-tomcat.properties does the Tomcat class loader level. So it feeds into logging-tomcat.xml and logging-access.xml. At the logging-pasoe.properties does all the ABL application level. And the result of that is a logging.xml that has the contents of all of those. And if you've turned on any specific individual loggers, those get fed into that logging.xml as well. Okay, so it's actually a lot simpler than it was, and much easier to get it right. Again, 99% of the time, you're in these two properties files to make any logging changes. Okay, so where are those log files? Where do they live? The default place is in your instance logs directory. For the Apache Tomcat logs, again, they're configured by that logging-tomcat.properties. You've got the Catalina log. Catalina log is the main Tomcat log, so the Tomcat server itself, that's where it logs. There's a Unix-only version of that log, catalina.out, which is pretty much anything that Tomcat would have written to the console goes into that catalina.out. There's a localhost.date.log. That is the place where web applications log. So if the mechanisms of the web applications themselves, if they are doing logging, they'll show up in that localhost log. There's the localhost access log. That's the one I've mentioned a couple of times. That one's really important. That's where you see all the HTTP requests and HTTP responses logged. And we'll be looking at how to configure that a bit. If you're using the Tomcat manager, there's a manager log. And if you're using virtual hosts, there's a host manager log. So those you may be using the manager, but rarely use the virtual hosts, at least that I've seen. Okay, at the ABL application level, there are three main logs there. There's the ABL application log. So again, these are also in your instance logs directory, but instead of being configured by logging-tomcat, these are configured by logging-passoe. There's the main ABL application log. There's the authorization log and the authentication log. All three of those configured by that same properties file. And then, again, with the same properties file, we didn't want to create yet another properties file. So with the same properties file, we also configure those additional logs. So those include the OE manager log, the debugger log, the OE proxy log, the OE health scanner log, and the secure token service log. Okay, so what about our agent log? kind of glossed over that. The agent log is configured the way it always has been. All right, so I guess technically there's three properties files. The third property file would be your OpenEdge.properties. So OpenEdge.properties, if you're looking to configure the agent logging, you look for a section called appserver.sessionmanager. And the name of your ABL app. And there, you've got agent logging level, which can be error, basic, verbose, extended, or off. And then you've got a template that says what the file name looks like. And I'm going to talk about a piece of that in a second here. And then the agent log entry types. The log entry types are a lot like the ones we've known and loved for years. But there are a few new ones for the multi-session agent. So there's MSAS sessions, MSAS signals, and MSAS background. Those are all in the documentation, so I won't talk about those. But I haven't listed all of the possible log entry types. But I think most people find 4GL trace and DB connects really quickly when they're trying to debug an issue, right? So that's the place that you would turn those on. Okay, I've mentioned a couple of times now this buzzword Mapped Diagnostic Context. What is that? Well, Mapped Diagnostic Context, MDC, solves a problem, a number of problems. It can answer questions like, what log messages belong to each customer, or each request, or each remote host, right? So the idea behind Mapped Diagnostic Context is actually kind of a simple idea with a complex name. The idea behind it is that you can inject context into each log message. So as the log message is being generated at runtime, you can add more information to that log message. So what can we add to it? Well, let's start with the access log. We'll talk about that again. The access logs in the instance logs directory, configured by that logging-tomcat.properties. And what happens with MDC is you have these substitution parameters that you can put into that pattern. So you've got that template that determines what the log message is going to look like. You can add these substitution parameters that have really important information. Like, for example, you can add an OpenEdge request ID. So this request ID is new for 12.0, and I'll show you what that looks like. Very, very valuable. You can inject the user ID. You can inject arbitrary HTTP headers. So if there's a header on your request that you want included in your log message, you can inject that here. You can do HTTP response headers, HTTP cookies, and there are dozens more of these things that are kind of standard things. I've picked out only one of them here. %D. You can inject the elapsed time in milliseconds. All right? Yeah?
Can we inject our own text?
Your own text? I don't think so. I don't think so. You could make it an HTTP header and inject it that way. But are you saying the same text all the time?
Maybe I just germinated.
If it's just the same text all the time, if it's the same text all the time, you can just put it in the pattern, right? But that would be interesting to have some sort of plugin that you could generate some runtime text. But yeah. So we'll think about that. We'll think about that. All right. So this is what you can do with the access log. Again, I didn't list all of them. These are kind of the new important ones. This request ID, user ID, and then the HTTP headers. If you're looking at the ABL application logging, it's got a similar set. So it's got that request ID, it's got the user ID, but it also has a session ID. So the PASOE session ID you can inject into that log message. The web app context name and the transport name. So those are all things that you can put in there. In addition, with the ABL application log, you can do pretty much all the things you could do with the access log. So you can do all the HTTP sorts of stuff. So you could do remote host, remote address, server name, URI, protocol, method, or any of the HTTP headers that you wanted to include. So you can see if you needed to tack on a specific header to identify a certain type of client or a certain type of customer, you could include those in your log file, right? By just adding that header on the client side, you can make sure it made it all the way to your log files. Okay. Spring authentication. So the authentication log has its own special set of MDC types. It's got the event type, which I believe is always authentication. It's got the event status. So if the authentication succeeded or failed, you can log that. It's got the client account name, and there's 2 levels of reasons for the authentication failures. So you can get a fail reason and then a fail detail. And they can be, you can make those different levels of information. So the fail reason can be short and the fail details can be long if you wanted to. And then again, you can put all of those, any of those HTTP headers in that authentication log, or any of the headers or any of that HTTP request information. All right, so again, you're kind of unifying these logs by putting the same information all the way down. So again, let's say you had a specific client type and you wanted to identify that. You could identify that all the way from your access log all the way down to your agent log. Okay. Authorization, another set specific to authorization. Again, the type, I believe, is always authorization. The status in this case is granted or denied. You get the user ID, you get the URL of the object, the resource that failed authorization. Okay? And you get some attributes about that. And then again, the whole set of HTTP values and HTTP headers is there to use to inject into those messages. Okay, so there's one little twist with configuring HTTP headers in MDC. They're all off by default. So if you want to inject a header, you have to turn it on first. You got to go to OEABL security properties and add it to a list. There's this list, MDC filter header list. And so if you want to add a specific HTTP header, make sure it gets in that list. Otherwise, it blocks all the headers. So an example of that in the access log configuration. So again, that's in logging-tomcat.properties. You can see up here in the header list, I did header name 1, header name 2, and then in that pattern, in that template, I actually put %header, header name 1, %header, header name 2. So it's as easy as that to configure. But you do have to remember, sometimes you go and you add an HTTP header to your log message and you say, why is that not coming out? And then, oh yeah, I gotta actually turn it on. Okay, so what else should I know? What else is there that we gotta know about? Well, you can configure that log directory path. So if you need to move the logs somewhere else, you can go to appserver.properties in the conf directory, and there's a property there called Catalina logging folder, and you can point that anywhere, and that whole set of logs for your instance will move somewhere else. Okay? We initially did this for Docker again, because when you've got a Docker instance, you want to have the log files outside of the container so that you can keep those, and then if it goes away, you've got the log files. Yeah?
So is that a dynamic change? I mean, I can do that on a...
Ooh, I don't know. Is that dynamic?
I doubt it. If so, what happens?
Yeah, I'm guessing it's not dynamic. Yeah. Most of the appserver.properties is not.
Well, these are all the top hellos.
Yeah.
So nothing will happen until you restart Tomcat.
Yeah, but would you really move all of your log files to a different place in the middle of?
Oh yeah, you can do that with clean.
So you said to reclaim space?
Let's say you're running low on space.
Okay. Let's thank you. Thank you very much. Another thing you can do is archive your logs. So using the utility, there are a couple of utilities that you use to administer PAS-OE. There's PASMan and TCMan. So if you're using PASMan, you can be anywhere in a ProEnv environment, and you can do a PASMan -i instance name clean-a. Or if you want to use TCMan, make sure you're pointing at the instance bin directory, and you can do a TCMan clean-a, and that will archive the logs to a date-stamped log directory.
That's a good point. We should probably make that configurable so if you were to want to get them out of the instance.
Yeah, and what we've seen customers do is once they're archived, they have a process that just goes and moves them offline and compresses them and things like that. So, okay. The one other thing that I promised I would mention, so agent log rollover. So previously, the agent logs didn't roll over. And I can't remember when we added that. Is that 12.0 new for? Yeah, I think it's not default for 11.7, but it is default for 12.0. And what actually controls that rollover, that agent log file rollover, is this timestamp template. So if you have that YYYMMDD in the name of your log file, it will roll over. If you omit that, it doesn't roll over. Okay? So let me just, in the time I have left, let me show you some real log files. So I'm going to kind of focus on the access log. Can you see that now with the light? We tried to make it darker in here. So I'm going to focus on the access log, but the principles are pretty much the same across all the logs, right? So I've got a really simple access log here. I've made 3 requests. I made a web request, a REST request, and an APSV request. So you can see the log file up at the top. And then down at the bottom, I've got the logging-tomcat.properties that configured that log file, right? So if we look at the access log, we've got the name of the log file up here. And then we've got this pattern. So you can see how the pattern works. This %H is the host name. So that first entry is the host name. The %L is the remote log. And then we get into this, the ones that I was talking about. We've got OE request user ID. So I was using a user called REST user. So I injected the name of that user into my log messages. There's the date. We've got the date next. We've got the request, so the URL of the request. We've got the status code, how big the request, the size in bytes, and then another one of these MDC attributes, which is the request ID. So let me scroll over to show you those request IDs. So I've made 3 requests. So I got request ID 1, 2, and 3. And you'll see that there's actually 3 components to that request ID. There's the application name. R means the REST adapter. W means the web the REST transport. I'm sorry. W means the web transport, and A means the APSV. So you can see the 3 there, and that'll become really important as we go along. You'll see how that ties together. So let me show another example here. This is another access log, but what I've done, if we look at this pattern, at the very end of the pattern here, I've added the accept header, so the HTTP accept header. And again, I remembered to go to my OEABL security.properties, and I added it to the list. So I've got this MDC filter header list accept, all right? And I added it to my pattern. And if you look at the end of this log message, I've actually got the header printed out, application/JSON. So the accept header on that request coming in was application.json. So I can track that through. The authentication log, so if we look at, so authentication is configured by logging-pasui.properties. You can see it's got a similar pattern here. It's got date, context. Again, we have this request ID. We've got the status of the event, the login client principal, the fail reason, and fail detail here. And so you can see it all here. Here's that wonderful request ID repeated again. We can see that it was a failure, REST user 2, and the reason was a bad account secret. Okay? Same sort of thing happens in the authorization. We've got, let me come down to here. You've got the authorization user ID. The important thing too is this fail object. So if authorization fails, it will give you the actual object that failed. So if we look at this one, it's this object, REST OE ping service OE ping, that failed. Yeah? Okay. And it failed because it didn't have the right role. Access is denied. Right? So you can inject all of those things into your log file based on these MDC tags. Okay, so if you thought I forgot the agent log, here's an example of an agent log. And what I've done is I wrote a little activate.p, and I said message session current request info request ID. And it's that same beautiful request ID you can see up here in the top in the log. So this log message was generated by that ABL piece of ABL, and I can inject that with ABL code. I can inject that into a message. Okay. All right, so let me go back here. And I believe that's it. Questions? Yeah.
When does the properties get evaluated and injected into the XML? Is that done at tailoring time or during startup time?
So the properties files get read actually on the fly. So there's a time period that you can set in each of those XML files that says how often it scans that file.
And the properties that the user can configure, the settings that they put into to say where the files are, how big they are, yada yada. When do those values get written, or are they just there?
No, those XML files get read on a period,
right.
and
the user edits the properties ones, right?
and those get sucked in as part of reading that file.
Okay.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah. So
Are you asking if it's dynamic, you make a change and it just happens?
yes.
Well, I'm looking for the period in time when that event happens, that hey, these properties, their values are now in these XML files.
Yeah. It's as part of reading that XML. It evaluates the property
and where I
files.
was headed was to further the question about the space removing the logs. Logback does rescan and reread the XML.
Yeah.
If I did end up changing a value,
Yeah, he was specifically asking about the agent log,
the agent.
right? So the agent log, that's not dynamic, right? But everything that's logged back is. So if you turn on one of those specific name loggers,
Technically, if you to allow runtime updates, that includes the agent log.
yeah, should, but
Log entry type.
Yeah. Right, you can't move it.
Right.
you can't move it. Yeah, you can't move it. So we should look at that. We should look at making that happen. But for all the logback ones, which means the Tomcat class loader and the ABL application, those are dynamic essentially. So if you want to turn on one of those named loggers and get some group of logging statements in the middle of your application run, you can do that. You can bump it up to debug and start getting debug messages in your log. Other questions? Yeah.
You took us through files. Are all these parameters available in OpenEdge Management Studio?
I don't know that. Are these available in OEM?
So, I mean, OEM would just provide you a text box. So
They just provide the text? Okay. Yeah, I really don't know that.
Can you modify those properties files in OpenEdge management right now?
Yes, my staff is all done that, they don't want that heavy file.
We haven't added those yet.
They are really simple property files, though. Name value pairs. So easy to edit. Usually don't screw those up. It was easy to screw up the XML files, but the property files is much harder to make a mistake. Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.